By the third night of the Iron Creek blizzard, Stone Hollow Ranch had vanished into white. Wind tore across the Wyoming flats at better than 50 miles an hour. The thermometer nailed to the bunkhouse wall had stopped meaning anything around 25 below. Snow buried the fence line and erased any difference between the ground and the sky. At the north corner of the hay barn, one brace on the windbreak Thomas Ashford had built 6 weeks earlier groaned and gave an inch. He tied a length of rope around his waist and pressed the other end into Beatrice Calder's gloved hands. If that wall failed, wind would find the barn's offset door and pack it shut with drift before morning. Inside, 8-year-old Sam counted marker posts through the gaps in the shutters. The baby cried behind a hung canvas curtain. A heifer strained through early labor in the near stall. Cyrus Wendell's hired man, who had laughed at Thomas's willow wall not 2 months before, lay half-frozen beside the stove, having stumbled in out of the storm an hour earlier. The rope went taut once, then it went still. 6 weeks earlier, Thomas Ashford had walked onto this property asking for nothing more than a little milk for his son. How the whole ranch had come to rest on whether he could still be standing at the end of a rope was not a question he had time to answer. Late in October of 1889, Thomas Ashford reached Stone Hollow Ranch on the edge of the Wyoming Territory with a borrowed mule cart and 2 children. He was 37, though the trail from Nebraska had put another 10 years on his face. His coat had been mended twice with 2 different scraps of cloth, neither matching the other. His wife Ellen had died of a fever the previous spring, and after that there had been no way to keep working section crews on the railroad while raising a boy and a girl still in arms. He had spent 9 years before that repairing depot buildings, hand pumps, and freight wagons along the line, and it was steady work, but it was work that took a man away for weeks at a stretch, and a widower couldn't leave 2 children behind with no one to mind them. 3 ranches along the way had turned him off before he'd finished asking. The first offered him a week mending fence and made it plain the offer didn't extend to Sunday, let alone to 2 small children underfoot. The second gave them 1 night's shelter in a cold outbuilding before sending them back to the road at first light, the rancher's wife pressing a single biscuit into Sam's hand as something like an apology. The third, an older woman running a modest spread alone, looked at the baby a long while and suggested, not unkindly, that the girl might do better placed with a family better suited to raising her, and Thomas had thanked her for her time and walked on without another word, because there was nothing in that suggestion he intended to consider. His son, Sam, 8 years old, had stopped asking how much farther some 3 days back. He walked beside the cartwheel without complaint, watching the road the way a much older boy might, as if he'd already decided complaining wouldn't change how far they still had to go. His daughter, not yet a year old, had gone quiet in the way that Thomas worried more than crying ever had. On their last evening on the road before Stone Hollow, she would take nothing but a little grain porridge thinned with water, and even then she fussed at it. That same night, Thomas watched Sam fold half his cornbread into his coat pocket, even after Thomas had promised there would be food again tomorrow. He understood, watching him do it, that the boy had simply stopped believing there would be a tomorrow with food in it, and there was nothing Thomas could say that would undo 3 ranches worth of doors closing on them. Stone Hollow Ranch appeared past a low ridge scoured bare by wind. The barn roof sagged along its ridgeline, the shingles curling at the edges from one too many hard winters without repair. Its main doors opened straight into the northwest weather, the worst possible orientation for a place that clearly saw real cold. A row of young aspen saplings stood too close to the barn's east wall, planted, Thomas guessed on sight, for summer shade rather than winter shelter, a decision that made sense in July and would mean nothing at all in January. Smoke came sideways off the cabin chimney, caught by wind that had no business moving that hard so early in the season. But in the corral, milk cows stood steady and unbothered, and that told Thomas something about whoever ran this place before he'd said a single word. Beatrice Calder stood at the stock trough breaking a skin of early ice with the flat of a hatchet when Thomas came into the yard. Her sleeves were rolled to the elbow despite the cold, a tally book tucked into her belt, one glove worn thin and pale across the palm from years of holding reins. She looked at the stranger and the 2 children for a long moment, unhurried, before she asked her only question. "What work do you know?" Thomas didn't offer his story, not yet. Barn framing, water lines, wagon wheels, roofing, whatever needs fixing before winter finds it first. And what is it you need? His eyes went to his daughter, quiet against his shoulder, chewing at the corner of her blanket because hunger had outlasted crying somewhere back on the road. I need milk for my children, a place out of the wind tonight. I'll fix what's about to break here if you'll let me. Beatrice glanced past him towards her own barn, unreadable. What makes you think anything's broken? Your doors face the wrong wind, Thomas said, nodding towards the barn. Your hay's pulling damp off the ground under that stack. That trough will freeze solid inside 2 weeks, maybe less. Confidence was cheap on the frontier. Proof was not, and Beatrice's face didn't move to suggest she believed either yet. She studied the boy standing silent at the cartwheel, then the baby resting against Thomas's trembling arms, and stepped forward without answering any one of his claims, lifting the little girl gently away from him before he'd finished making his case. Milk comes first, she said quietly. Your claims can wait for morning. She led them inside without further questions. In the kitchen, she warmed cow's milk with a little water, tested the temperature against the inside of her wrist like a mother might, and fed the baby slowly from a spoon, while Thomas sat across the table too worn down to protest that he wasn't hungry himself. A bowl of stew and cornbread and dried apples appeared in front of Sam. Another waited for Thomas, who insisted quietly that he didn't need it, and got it set in front of him anyway, without further comment. Sam ate without speaking. Before he'd finished, he folded a piece of cornbread into his coat pocket the same way he had every night on the road. Beatrice noticed and said nothing about it, only laid a second piece down beside his bowl as though it had always belonged there, no ceremony attached to the gesture at all. Between quiet bites, the facts that mattered passed across the table one at a time, offered rather than asked for. Ellen had died 6 months earlier of a fever that took hold fast and never let go. Beatrice's husband, Robert Calder, the ranch's original builder, had been killed 3 winters back when a logging wagon slid off an icy stretch of the freight road above the canyon. Beatrice had run 400 head alone in the years since, and had lost 11 of them the previous winter to weather she still didn't understand the reason for. She had no children of her own, a fact stated plainly and left there, without invitation to ask further. That night, Beatrice opened the door to the old foreman's room and pulled down an unfinished cradle from the storage loft, one Robert had started years before and never got back to. One rail along the side was still rough, never sanded smooth like the rest. Thomas noticed she'd kept it all this time rather than burning it for kindle on some hard winter night when firewood ran short, and understood without being told that it had meant something to keep it anyway. Nell slept peacefully in the unfinished cradle that first night. Sam fell asleep with one hand still resting protectively over the cornbread in his coat pocket, not quite ready yet to trust that it would still be there in the morning without checking. Before sunrise, Thomas was already out walking the ranch. He didn't pick up a single tool that first morning. He watched instead. A scrap of wool tied by the barn door fluttered and told him exactly how the wind curled through the gap in the frame. He dug into the base of the haystack with a borrowed shovel and found the bottom layer damp and starting to sour, the smell rising sharp the moment he disturbed it. He poured water into one end of the trough and timed how slowly it drained back out, longer than it should have taken by a fair margin. Inside the cabin, a thin line of frost had already crept along the chinking between the logs, visible even in the dim early light. Beatrice followed without announcing herself, arms folded, watching him work through his silent inventory. When Thomas finally spoke, he pointed rather than explained with his hands the way some men like to.
"Your barn isn't losing heat because the walls are thin," he said. "It's losing heat because the wind walks straight through your doors, and there's nothing slowing it down before it gets there." He knelt beside the hay. "This stack is spoiling from the bottom up. Another month and you'll lose 1/3 of it to rot before the cattle ever get a bite." He nodded toward the pump. "Your water line sits too shallow. It's got nowhere to drain after use, which means it sits full and waits for the first hard freeze to find it." His hand rested against the cabin wall. The chinkings pulled loose from the logs here and here. He turned last toward the row of young aspens near the barn. "And those trees are planted wrong for what's coming. They'll do fine against a summer wind off the west. They'll do nothing at all against what comes down out of the north in January." Beatrice's arms stayed folded. Beatrice planted those. He wasn't wrong to plant something there, Thomas said carefully. He planted for the wrong season is all. The trees didn't change. The weather that matters most did. Some of the tension eased out of her shoulders, though her face gave little else away. She studied him a long moment more before finally pointing toward the tool shed. You get 1 week. Then I'll decide whether you see real problems or just enjoy inventing them for a stranger to fix. Thomas started with the hay, since it was the job least likely to spark an argument, and the one that proved itself fastest. He, Beatrice, and Sam pulled the bottom layers away together and found exactly the sour, damp patches he'd predicted, several of them warm to the touch where moisture had pooled against the cold ground beneath. Thomas built a raised crib 9 inches off the earth using old pine fence rail already lying behind the shed, dividing the reworked stack into smaller sections with narrow air channels left between each one, rather than piling it back into a single dense mound. Sam's job was simple and exact. 9 inches, Thomas told him, and the boy measured every gap with a short stick, counting each space out loud as he went, more words strung together than he'd spoken since Nebraska. The water line came next. Thomas opened a test trench by hand and found the pipe buried barely 18 inches down, far shallower than it needed to be for that country. Needs to sit near 4 feet here, he said, and it needs enough fall along its length that it empties itself completely after every use, so there's nothing sitting still in the pipe waiting on a hard freeze. Beatrice studied the length of trench still ahead of them. We don't have time to redo the whole run before the ground hardens. Then we don't do the whole run, Thomas said. We protect the stretch between the well and the milking cows first. Everything past that waits until spring. Late that same afternoon, Ruth Dunmore, an elderly neighboring widow who quietly kept watch over the scattered families across that stretch of the valley, stopped by with fresh goat's milk and news carried the way news always traveled in thin country. Cyrus Wendell, she mentioned, had already been asking around about Beatrice's new man. Nobody at the table answered her directly. As Ruth set 2 loaves of bread down, she noticed the folded biscuit still peeking from Sam's coat pocket and glanced toward Beatrice, silently asking whether she should leave an extra loaf. Beatrice headed her head. Leave 2. That evening, Thomas handed Beatrice a short list of materials, every item that could be salvaged from what already sat around the property marked first, with only what genuinely needed buying listed last. By the 3rd day, stake lines marked the outline of a new windbreak across the open ground north of the barn, an L-shaped run standing 36 feet out, not tight against the structure and not directly in front of its doors, but far enough out to slow the wind's force before it ever reached the buildings. Lodgepole pine would carry the frame's weight. Willow cut fresh from along the creek would be woven between the posts, loose enough by design to let some wind pass through, rather than standing rigid against the full force of it. Sod and brush would anchor the base against frost heave. Thomas and Sam were setting the last post that afternoon when a rider stopped at the fence without dismounting right away. Cyrus Wendell ran the largest operation in the valley and twice offered to buy Stone Hollow outright since Robert's death, both times refused flatly, and in the years since, he'd spoken about the ranch's eventual failure the way other men spoke about whether they were only waiting out. He looked over the half-finished frame and let a thin smile settle onto his face. Ashford's willow wall, is it? He nudged one of the fresh posts with the toe of his boot. All that'll do is catch snow and bury your own barn door for you. Thomas kept both hands steady on the post driver. If I set it too close, you'd be right about that. And if the distance is what matters more than the wall itself, Chrysler said, unconvinced, then turned toward Beatrice instead of continuing the argument with Thomas directly. Since when does a drifter become your engineer, B? Beatrice never looked up from the survey stakes she was checking. He's not a drifter, she said, calm and even. He's my foreman until the work proves otherwise. The words surprised everyone standing in that yard, including Thomas, though he kept his face steady and went on driving the post. Chrysler let out a short laugh. You'll still need my freight road once the passes close up, same as always.
If you've got business to discuss, put it in writing and send it up proper." Chrysler gathered his reins and looked once more at the unfinished wall before turning his horse. "Winter will decide soon enough which one of us is wasting time out here." He rode off without waiting for an answer. Sam watched until the rider disappeared over the rise, then looked up at his father. What if he's right about it?
Thomas picked up the next willow pole from the pile. "Then we change it before the snow proves him right instead of us." The first hard squall arrived sooner than either of them expected, barely a week into the build, and it exposed the flaw fast. Thomas had tied narrow strips of cloth along the willow posts beforehand, not to decorate the wall, but to watch how the air actually moved through it, rather than simply guess and hope. The answer came within minutes of the wind picking up. The center section of the windbreak had been woven too tight. Wind climbing up and over the wall rolled back down hard on the far side, slamming into the ground directly behind it and driving thin snow and dry grass straight toward the barn entrance instead of away from it. One woven panel tore loose from its lashing entirely. An old milk cow, spooked by the sudden noise and motion at the offset gate, nearly tore a hinge free trying to bolt past it. Far off across the flat, two of Cyrus Wendell's hands paused their wagon on the road long enough to watch the whole thing happen. Thomas didn't waste time defending the mistake to anyone, least of all himself. He cut away nearly a fifth of the willow weave from the center section that same afternoon. Beatrice studied the fluttering cloth strips a long moment before offering a suggestion of her own. Try weaving the next section on a diagonal instead of straight across. Let the wind spread out sideways instead of fighting one flat wall head-on. They worked until well past sunset reworking the weave. When the next gust came through, it passed through the looser diagonal weave, lost most of its force in the process, and never reached the barn at all. "A windbreak that stops everything just turns into another kind of cliff," Thomas said, watching the cloth strips settle. "It only needs to take the strength out of the wind. It was never meant to stop it outright." The offset entrance revealed a second flaw that same evening. The turn into the barn was too sharp, and the same skittish cow refused to walk the dark corner it created. Beatrice measured the passage with her eye rather than a tape. "We widen it," she said simply. They moved the gate over, opened the angle, and hung a lantern in the space where the shadows had been spooking the cattle. As full darkness settled over Stone Hollow that night, Beatrice handed Thomas the willow cutters without a word of ceremony. "Your wall," she said, looking at the cloth strips still dancing faintly in the last of the evening wind. "My wind." Then, just barely, something that might have been the start of a smile. "We fix both together, or neither of us fixes anything worth keeping." A week after that, Ezra Doyle, the county stock inspector, rode out after hearing that Beatrice Calder was rebuilding her whole operation ahead of the season. He didn't laugh at any of it, not once. Instead, he asked hard, specific questions. A tighter barn could trap moisture as easily as it kept out cold. Deep bedding left unturned could build up ammonia fast enough to sicken a herd. A hay crib packed wrong could heat itself from the inside if the air inside it had nowhere to move. A homemade water line, if not vented properly, could pull dirt straight back into the trough on the draw. That canvas curtain hanging near the stove was only safe as long as it stayed a fixed distance from the pipework. Thomas listened without interrupting once, and together they walked the whole property, checking each point in turn: the ridge vent, the bedding by hand, the warmth held inside the reworked haystack, the careful distance between canvas and stovepipe, the drain valve now fitted beneath the water line. Before riding out, Doyle made one specific request: keep a written ledger for 3 weeks at minimum. Morning and evening temperature, firewood burned, hay fed out, barn moisture, every single time you have to break ice on that trough by hand. Beatrice hung a plain ledger by the kitchen door that same evening and put the first pencil into Sam's hand rather than her own. "Write today's numbers," she told him, and the boy carefully marked the first line, the numbers small and careful in a child's hand. From that morning forward, facts would speak in that house before anyone's opinion got the chance to.
But before the ledger could prove anything at all, the cold tested them first with a plain, practical failure. The first batch of chinking mortar had too much clay mixed into it, and after only 2 cold nights, the fresh seams shrank clean away from the log walls, fine cracks opening along nearly every seam Thomas had just finished sealing. A strip of wool held against the gaps still fluttered faintly in the draft it should have stopped entirely. Thomas reached for his scraper without complaint, already resigned to starting the whole job over from nothing. Beatrice stopped him before he'd made the first pass. "My mother used to seal sheep sheds a different way. Less clay, more animal hair worked in, more rye straw. Score the first layer before you finish it with the second, so the two actually grip each other instead of just sitting stacked." They mixed a second batch to her mother's proportions. This one gripped the log walls instead of pulling loose from them within the week. Later that same evening, searching through the storage loft for spare rope, Thomas found an old rolled canvas, its leather stitching along the edge still fully sound after years untouched. "Ellen made this," he said quietly, unrolling it part way. "We used it as a draft curtain in a railroad camp the winter before Sam was born." He began measuring where it would need to be cut to fit the doorway between the sleeping room and the main room. "You don't have to cut it if you'd rather keep it whole," Beatrice said. "It's meant to be used," Thomas said, and they hung the whole thing together without removing a single stitch from its original seams. While they worked, Thomas spoke of Ellen for the first time since they'd arrived at Stone Hollow. She had never once feared the cold the way some women did, but she always checked a child's wrist for fever before she ever checked the state of the fire. She could sew a tighter leather seal on a canvas edge than most men could manage building that same seal out of wood and nails.
Beatrice, listening, mentioned quietly that Robert had always set 2 tin cups beside the stove first thing every morning without fail, whether or not there was anyone but the 2 of them to drink from them. The next morning, 2 cups stood there again on the stove ledge. Neither one of them said a word about why. That night, the room held its warmth noticeably longer than it had on any prior evening. Thomas rested his hand briefly against Ellen's old leather stitching before letting it go and turning back to the rest of his work. The canvas stayed exactly where they'd hung it, and stayed there through everything that followed. The rhythm of the ranch slowly settled into something steadier than either of them had known separately. While Thomas worked outdoors with both hands from dawn until dark, Beatrice cared for Nell without any particular ceremony attached to it, warming milk, changing blankets, walking slow circles near the stove whenever the baby grew restless in the evenings. Before long, she could tell, without needing to think about it, the difference between a cry that meant cold and a cry that meant hunger. At first, she'd held the baby too stiffly, unused to the shape of a child against her. And then something in her simply changed without either of them remarking on it. Nell stopped crying the moment she heard Beatrice's boots crossing the cabin floor. Small fingers reached for the collar of her coat whenever she came close enough. More than once, the baby fell fully asleep against Beatrice's shoulder while she still had the ledger open and a pencil in her free hand, recording the day's hay and firewood without missing a line. One evening, Thomas came inside and found them standing exactly that way, and reached automatically to take Nell from her. Beatrice gave the smallest shake of her head. She only just fell asleep. Leave her be a while yet. Thomas laid his dry gloves down beside the stove where she could warm her own hands later, and went back outside without further comment to check the trough one last time before dark. On another afternoon, Sam helped Beatrice shell dry beans into a wooden bowl at the kitchen table, working in a long, comfortable silence before finally looking up. "Why don't you have children of your own?" Beatrice kept her eyes on her hands. "Some rooms get built and never get filled, no matter how much a person might want otherwise." Sam glanced toward the cradle where his sister slept in the corner. "That one's filled now, though." Beatrice said nothing to that, not right away. But the following morning, the leftover cornbread Sam always saved sat untouched on the table for the first time since they'd arrived at Stone Hollow. For the first time since his mother died, the boy had gone to sleep the night before simply believing there would still be food there in the morning, without needing to hide any of it away first. The first real cold snap arrived ahead of when anyone expected it, the temperature falling to 11 above zero by sunrise.
The old barn, before any of the work, had never managed to hold above 19 degrees on a bad night, drafts crossing the dirt floor all day long no matter how much straw was piled against them. Now, behind the finished windbreak and through the offset entrance, the same barn held steady between 29 and 33 degrees whenever the inner doors stayed properly shut. The cabin burned 5 armloads of firewood through a full cold night instead of the 7 it once needed. The bedding stayed dry beneath the cattle. The ground beneath the raised hay cribs smelled clean instead of sour for the first time in longer than Beatrice could easily remember. Then the water stopped entirely. The buried section of line stayed open and clear, exactly as intended, but the metal coupling near the trough, exposed briefly to open air where the pipe crossed above ground, had frozen solid overnight. Ezra Doyle had specifically warned about exactly this kind of failure, and Thomas had missed it anyway in the rush of everything else. "I missed it," he said flatly, no excuse offered alongside the admission, already reaching for the axe to break the ice free. Together they built a small wooden box around the exposed coupling, packed it tight with dry wool waste, wrapped the whole thing in tarred cloth, and worked at it steadily until nearly midnight to get it properly sealed before the cold could claim it a second time. Beatrice walked partway through carrying 2 tin cups of hot chicory coffee, handing one over without a word. "I said I'd fix this ranch," Thomas said, taking the cup without quite meeting his eyes. The water still froze regardless. Beatrice blew across the steam rising from her own cup before answering. "You promised to fix it. You never once promised to guess right on the very first try. Nobody honest could promise that." The words stayed with him a good deal longer than the coffee's warmth did. The next morning they filled the trough again from the repaired line, and the water flowed steady and true, draining itself completely the moment the cattle finished, exactly as the design had intended from the start. For the first time since arriving at Stone Hollow, Thomas understood something that had nothing at all to do with pipes or freezing weather. Beatrice wasn't measuring him against whether he ever failed at something. She was measuring him against whether he stayed through a failure long enough to see it fixed properly. For 3 full weeks after that, the ledger filled steadily, one careful line at a time. Every morning, Sam wrote down the temperature in his careful child's hand. Beatrice added the firewood burned, the hay fed out, the milk collected, the moisture found in the bedding, and every single time the trough needed its ice broken by hand rather than draining clean on its own. Slowly, the numbers began building an argument entirely of their own matter, independent of anyone's opinion on the matter. Nearly 2 fewer armloads of firewood disappeared on the coldest nights than before. Hay consumption had dropped by close to 1/5. Milk output held steady rather than falling off the way it typically did deep into a hard winter. The trough hadn't frozen solid even once since the coupling had been properly repaired and boxed. Ezra Doyle rode back out and read every single page of the ledger from its very first entry through to the most recent line before finally closing the book. "I wouldn't call any of it fully proven yet," he said carefully, "but it's doing exactly what it ought to be doing, and that's worth more than most claims I hear out this way." Cyrus Wendell rode in not long after that visit, making his position plain without much preamble. "Once the real snow comes," he said, "my freight road closes to your herd unless you're willing to sign your spring water rights over to mine." "No," Beatrice said, flat and immediate. Cyrus only shrugged at the refusal. "A few cold nights aren't a whole winter yet, B. You'll want that road eventually." After he'd ridden off, Thomas asked only one practical question. "How many days of hay do we have if his road stays closed on us straight through?" 28 by the old counting, Beatrice answered. "Longer than that if this ledger is telling us the truth about what we've actually saved." Thomas studied the gray sky a long moment before answering. "Then we prepare like it's going to be 28 days, not 20 day." Without further discussion, Beatrice opened the ledger, wrote 28 beneath the final entry, and drew a single firm line beneath it. From that moment on, the whole ranch would prepare itself for the winter they both hoped, without saying so aloud, would never actually arrive in full force. The sky began changing 3 full days before the storm itself reached them. At midday, the milk cow Beatrice called Juniper turned her back deliberately to the northwest wind and simply refused to graze any further that afternoon. The air itself seemed to grow heavier by the hour. Low gray clouds stretched out across the whole basin in long, unbroken bands by evening. Just before sunset, the wind died away entirely without any warning at all, and all birds along the fence lines had already gone quiet or vanished outright. Thomas and Beatrice stopped discussing any further improvements to the property that evening. From that point forward, everything they did was aimed squarely at survival rather than betterment. Marker posts went into the frozen ground every 20 feet between the cabin and the barn. The cistern was filled completely to its top edge. Hay was pulled in closer to the barn itself while carefully preserving the air channels Thomas had built into the crib months earlier. Every rope lashing the willow windbreak together was checked and rechecked a second time. The milk cows and the youngest calves were moved into the most sheltered section of the barn available. Extra lanterns were hung along the widened offset entrance. A canvas repair bag, packed and ready, waited beside the front door.
Sam watched the final marker post disappear into the hard, frozen ground. Why do we need both the rope and the posts? Wouldn't just one be enough? Thomas finished tying off the last knot before answering. A rope keeps a man from drifting off course entirely in a whiteout. Posts tell that same man whether he's actually still moving somewhere or just standing still thinking he's making progress. While searching through the shed for extra rope that same afternoon, Beatrice found an old stake bearing Robert's hand-carved mark from years before and carried it out herself to set in the very first position nearest the cabin door. Thomas, meanwhile, reinforced the repair bag's strap using a length of leather Ellen had sewn years earlier for an entirely different purpose, making sure nothing useful was left behind unprepared inside the house. That evening, Ruth Dunmore stopped by once more on her way south to shelter with relatives until the worst of the storm passed through. She left fresh goat's milk on the table as she always did, her eyes lingering a moment on the 2 tin cups sitting beside the stove, though she said nothing about it either way. Near dusk, a written warning arrived by Ryder from Ezra Doyle, direct and urgent. An Arctic front was pushing down hard out of the mountains to the north. Winds could exceed 60 miles an hour once it fully arrived. Nobody should leave shelter at all once the snow itself began falling in earnest. Everything that could reasonably be prepared had been prepared by nightfall. Now the ranch would simply have to wait for the only judge whose opinion would actually matter in the end. The Iron Creek blizzard arrived before dawn the following morning, the first blast striking exactly from the northwest, precisely as Thomas had built every part of the system to anticipate. The willow windbreak bent hard under the initial force, but held its ground entirely. Snow gathered exactly where it was meant to, well clear of the barn's main entrance. The offset doorway broke the worst of the direct wind before it ever reached the cattle sheltered inside. The cistern stayed sealed and protected beneath its cover. The trough filled on schedule and drained itself completely before the exposed coupling had any real chance to freeze again. Behind Ellen's canvas curtain, the small sleeping room where the children stayed held its warmth steadily through the worst of the opening hours. Thomas and Beatrice crossed between the cabin and the barn one careful trip at a time, each of them clipped firmly to the guide rope the entire distance. By midday, one of the outermost marker posts had already vanished beneath drifting snow entirely. The next post in line still showed its fluttering strip of marker cloth, faint but visible through the worst of the whiteout conditions. Late that same afternoon, a dull, irregular pounding sound reached them from somewhere beyond the windbreak's outer edge. Thomas followed the line of remaining posts out into the blinding white and found Noah Pike, one of Cyrus Wendell's hired hands, half buried in a drift beside the next marker, his horse already long gone, his cheeks gone pale white with the early signs of frostbite. "Saw the cloth," he managed to say between slow, labored breaths. "That's the only reason I kept walking instead of just sitting down out there." Thomas hauled him inside without wasting breath on further conversation. Once Noah had warmed enough beside the stove to speak properly, he explained that he'd lost the rest of Cyrus's crew hours earlier in the whiteout, and that Cyrus's own north barn was losing its fight against the wind entirely, the cattle inside packed desperately into a single corner, still trying and failing to reach water that likely had already frozen over completely. Nobody in the room answered him directly. Noah looked up at Ellen's canvas curtain hanging between the two rooms, the very same system he'd openly mocked as Ashford's willow wall not 2 months earlier, and said nothing further about it at all.
The storm tightened its grip considerably overnight, the temperature dropping even further than it had the day before. Before sunrise on the third day, Maple, the oldest milk cow on the ranch, went into labor several weeks earlier than expected. Beatrice took one look at her and knew immediately that something had gone wrong. The calf was turned badly inside her. Dr. Amos Keene, the only veterinarian serving ranches across that whole stretch of the basin, had no possible way to reach them, every road already buried beyond passing. There would be no help beyond whoever was already standing inside that barn. While Thomas checked the water line one final time near the windbreak, Beatrice washed her hands carefully in water he'd managed to keep from freezing solid, tied Maple's tail aside, located the calf's front legs by feel alone, and worked slowly and methodically with a set of boiled calving straps, exactly the way Amos had once shown her years before. Sam held the lantern steady, his young hands shaking visibly despite his best effort to keep them still. "Watch her eyes," Beatrice told him quietly, and he obeyed without question. Thomas returned just as the final pull was needed most. The calf slid free onto the clean, dry straw beneath it, but didn't draw breath right away. Beatrice cleared its mouth quickly. Thomas rubbed hard at its ribs with a handful of clean straw. Without being asked to do anything at all, Sam placed a dry towel directly into Beatrice's open hand. For one long, terrible moment, absolutely nothing happened in that stall. Then the calf drew its first ragged breath, and everyone in the barn went completely still at once. From the cabin, faintly audible even through the storm, Nell began to cry. Noah Pike, still weak from his own ordeal the day before, pulled the unfinished cradle a little closer to the stove and quietly warmed another bottle of milk without needing to be asked. Nobody standing there considered themselves outside the work any longer, not after that. The dry bedding kept the newborn calf safely off the frozen barn floor. The offset entrance held the worst of the wind well clear of the calving stall throughout. Running water, kept clear against every expectation, had made clean hands possible at exactly the moment it mattered most. The lantern hung in the widened passage kept the rest of the cattle calm enough throughout to avoid a second crisis on top of the first. Sam finally let out a breath he seemed to have been holding since the moment the calf first hit the straw. The third full night of the storm brought the hardest wind yet. Just after midday, one of the north lashings on the windbreak finally snapped under the strain. The woven panel shook violently against its remaining anchors. If it gave way entirely, wind would pour straight through the offset passage unchecked, and snow would begin burying the barn entrance within hours, potentially sealing the cattle inside with no way to reach them until the storm broke completely. Thomas reached for the rope without hesitation. Beatrice caught the other end without needing to be told what it was for. Outside, the storm had erased everything beyond the very next marker post entirely. Thomas crawled from stake to stake through it and found one post had already snapped clean off. The loose willow lattice slammed into him without warning, knocking him flat into the snow. His repair bag burst open on impact, tools scattering across the drift in every direction, saved from being lost entirely only by Ellen's old leather strap, which somehow held the bag's main body from blowing away completely. Inside the barn, Maple bellowed loudly at the sudden noise. From the cabin, Nell's crying carried faintly through the wind. Beatrice gripped the rope with both hands and held steady, waiting. Then she felt 3 sharp, deliberate tugs come through the line, their agreed signal. She fed more rope out into the storm immediately. Thomas reached the broken section on his hands and knees and braced it with a spare willow pole, setting it firmly across the damaged frame rather than attempting a full rebuild in the dark and wind. It didn't need to last forever. It only needed to hold until morning brought enough light to fix it properly. The rope finally went still again. Beatrice pulled steadily, and a figure emerged out of the white darkness on one arm and one knee, barely upright. Thomas pushed himself the rest of the way up unassisted. "It'll hold until morning," he said, breathing hard. Beatrice looked past him at the storm still raging unbroken across the whole basin beyond the barn. "Morning is enough," she said. "It only has to be enough." By the 4th morning, the wind had finally begun to weaken in earnest. Nobody celebrated outright, not yet. They started counting instead, methodically,
one thing at a time. Every animal on the property remained alive. The newborn calf carried only a small patch of frostbite along one ear, nothing worse. The bedding throughout the barn remained fully dry. Water still flowed cleanly through the trough on schedule. The hay crib showed no sign of either heat buildup or spoilage anywhere along its length. The barn doors opened freely without needing to be dug out from drift first. Firewood remained stacked and ready beside the cabin stove. Noah Pike stood on his own 2 feet again without assistance. Thomas walked the full property that morning carrying a notebook rather than any sense of relief. One brace, he noted, had proven too light for the actual load it carried. 2 marker posts needed to be reset considerably deeper before the next storm arrived. The outer cloth strips would need stronger stitching to survive a full blizzard's duration. The wooden cover protecting the water coupling needed a proper sloped roof rather than the flat one he'd built in a hurry. Beatrice watched him writing steadily from a short distance away. "You've counted every weakness you can find before you've counted a single thing that actually survived," she observed. Thomas closed the notebook without looking up right away. "The living can wait an hour longer," he said. "A weakness doesn't get the privilege of hiding behind whatever went right this time around." Later that same day, the clouds finally broke open just enough to reveal a narrow strip of gray sky overhead. Steam rose visibly off the cattle's backs as they breathed into air that had finally, marginally warmed. "The children have their milk," Beatrice said quietly, watching the herd settle. Thomas studied the broken section of willow wall still needing proper repair. "The ranch still needs fixing regardless," he said. Neither one of them spoke about spring that day. Neither one of them spoke about leaving either, though the thought had likely crossed both of their minds more than once over the previous 4 days. That evening, Beatrice placed Thomas's dry gloves down beside the 2 tin cups already waiting near the stove, setting them there as naturally as if they had always belonged in exactly that spot. When the roads finally opened again nearly a week later, people came to Stone Hollow looking for real answers rather than the rumors that had already started circulating through the valley. Ezra Doyle arrived first, inspecting everything without any particular hurry, checking the barn's actual temperature, feeling the bedding directly with his bare hand, examining the full water system end to end, counting every surviving animal by hand, measuring the hay that remained, and reading every single page of the ledger from its very first entry through the last line written during the worst of the storm itself. At last, he closed the book for good. "The barn stayed drier than anything else in this basin managed," he said plainly. "The herd burned less feed than anyone had a right to expect. Stable water made the real difference here, more than anything else you built. That windbreak stood exactly where the snow wanted to settle instead of where your doors happened to need opening. And every single flaw you found early got corrected before this blizzard ever had the chance to find it for you." Noah Pike spoke up next, still favoring the hand that took the worst of the frostbite. "I'd be dead out there without those marker posts, plain and simple, no question about it." Cyrus Wendell came last of everyone, his own ranch having lost cattle outright and part of his north barn's roof torn away entirely in the same storm. He offered no apology at all, not directly. Instead, he looked out toward the repaired willow wall for a long moment. "How far out did you set it from the barn?" he asked, finally. 36 feet through the center. We adjusted some for the actual ground beneath it, and you never weave it tight enough to stop the wind completely, not anywhere along its length. That's the part most people get wrong first." Cyrus nodded once, short and unadorned. "Show me how it's done properly." Thomas walked beside him across the snow without another word passing between them and showed him exactly how it had been built, start to finish. Later that same evening, once everyone else had finally ridden out, Beatrice led Thomas into the small ranch office and placed a folded agreement down on the desk between them. It granted him a genuine share in the ranch's future profits, real authority over its water systems and structural work, and full responsibility for winter preparation going forward. One final line stood apart from all the rest. It read plainly, Sam and Nell would always have a home at Stone Hollow, regardless of whatever did or didn't happen between the 2 adults signing the agreement. Thomas looked up from the page. "Why give me part of something that's always been yours alone to give?" Beatrice met his eyes without any hesitation at all.
I'm not giving you anything that was ever mine to begin with." She turned the agreement gently to face him fully. "I'm simply naming, in writing, what you were already carrying here the whole time, whether either of us said so out loud or not." That evening, after the agreement had been signed by both of them, Thomas and Beatrice sat together beside the stove as the ranch settled into its very first quiet night since the blizzard had first arrived. The fire burned low and steady. Neither one of them rushed to fill the comfortable silence between them. At last, Thomas looked down into his cup. "I came here asking for nothing more than milk," he said. "I never once meant to end up owing you an entire life in return." Beatrice wrapped both hands around her own coffee cup. "You don't owe me one," she said simply. "But there's a life here regardless, if you find you're willing to share it properly." Thomas smiled, for the first time in longer than he could easily remember. "I'll stay until the snow's finally gone, then." Beatrice glanced toward the window, where patches of old ice still clung stubbornly to the fence line beyond. "Stay until the grass comes back properly instead." He lifted his eyes to meet hers directly. "Longer than that, if you'll have me." They didn't marry the moment the roads opened again, since the work itself still came first for both of them, as it always had. In the weeks that followed, they focused entirely on rebuilding the damaged sections of windbreak before the ground froze too hard to work it further. Under Thomas's careful guidance, neighboring ranches throughout the valley, Cyrus Wendell included eventually, gradually adopted the same winter preparation system that Stone Hollow had proven out through the worst that country could throw at it. It wasn't until early May that Thomas and Beatrice finally held a quiet wedding, witnessed only by Dr. Amos Keene and Inspector Ezra Doyle. The celebration itself lasted only long enough to properly sign the papers, since Maple had chosen that same week to go into labor yet again, and some things on a working ranch simply couldn't wait on romance to finish its business first.
Cyrus never attended the ceremony himself, but a neat, carefully bundled stack of straight willow stakes left resting beside the fence line served as something close enough to a silent blessing from him. A few days later, Sam looked up from his place at the ledger, pencil still in hand. "Do I have to start calling you something else now?" "You never have to call me anything at all that you don't truly mean," Beatrice told him gently. Sam nodded slowly and tried her given name first, and for a good while, that was enough for both of them. But weeks after that, tripping near one of the marker posts while running across the yard, he blurted out, "Ma," before catching himself mid-word. Beatrice rushed over at once to brush the dirt from his scraped hands, pretending not to have heard the word he'd very nearly finished saying aloud. Spring slowly returned to Stone Hollow in earnest. Beside the barn post where Sam had just carved a fresh line marking the season's first real snowmelt, little Nell took careful, unsteady steps toward Beatrice across the open yard. "Ma!" The small voice carried clearly across the quiet distance between them. Beatrice didn't rush forward to close the gap herself. She simply knelt down where she stood, patient, waiting for the girl to finish the last few steps entirely on her own power. Thomas traced his eyes slowly over the fully repaired windbreak, the open barn doors standing wide and steady, the cattle grazing peacefully on new spring grass beyond the fence. "And it still needs fixing here and there," he said. "That's a good thing," Beatrice replied, handing him the second tin cup without being asked. Stone Hollow hadn't survived that winter because the weather itself had shown any particular mercy toward them. It had shown none at all, not for a single hour of it. It survived because every real weakness in the place had been found and properly corrected well before the storm ever arrived looking for a way in.